If you are uncomfortable carrying a firearm for safety concerns, or if you're uncomfortable carrying with a round in the chamber, then stick around for this video and I'm going to explain exactly what it is that quality manufacturers do to keep you safe and keep you from shooting a hole in your own ass cheek while you're carrying your firearm. Hello Internet, welcome back to Arcane Armory. Today we are talking about handgun safeties and how they're implemented in your firearms to help keep you safe. So for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to talk about specific models of firearms. There's a couple of platforms we're going to cover, like revolvers, the Glock platform, the 1911 platform, but not so much each make and model and what safety features they offer. The point of this video is for you to identify the safety features that are on a pistol when you go shopping for one, or understand the safety features that your pistol has to know how to properly use that pistol safely in your everyday life. I'd like to address a few things like the statement that Glocks don't have safeties, or that 1911s aren't safe because they have to be carried cocked and locked, and along with a couple other misnomers or kind of ill-founded ideas about firearms as they pertain to the shooter's safety. Now, I don't make this video to make fun of anybody's knowledge. The idea here is to break down what manufacturers put in these firearms to help keep us safe as we're carrying them, and to have a more thorough understanding of these systems so that we know how to maintain them and how to inspect them and how to verify their function in our firearms to make sure that we're doing everything that we need to be doing. So before we get too far down this rabbit hole, I'm sorry this is going to be a little bit of a longer video. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm going to try not to be too disgusting, and it's monsooning outside, so if you hear the rain in the background, I'm sorry about that. I'm not a good enough sound editor to get rid of it. We have to break our safety mechanisms down into a couple of different categories. The first category is going to be active safeties. Active safeties are safeties that we as the shooter must manipulate on our firearms, and we commonly think of the thumb safety. The second category of safety is the passive safety. Now, passive safety is a mechanism that's operating within a firearm without any direct input from the user. These are things like drop safes and striker block safeties. A third category of safety is kind of inherent to the design of a certain pistol or platform or type of pistol. These are design features that help improve or sometimes detract from a pistol's safety just based on how it's designed. So with all that said, let's get into the different safety features that are on these pistols. I have here a pretty good representation of different safety features that should be found across the largest variety of your handguns. We have a double action revolver, we have a Glock platform. This is a PSA Dagger, but mechanically it's virtually identical to a Glock 19. We have a 1911. We have a double action hammer fired pistol. This is similar to a CZ75. It's kind of also similar to a Browning high power, but it is double action. And then we have a Ruger SR series, which blends a lot of the features of these other pistols, minus the revolver, together in a non-platform specific package. And finally, I have an example of a pistol that has all of the safety features required for the California pistol roster, what those look like and how it integrates some of the same safeties as the Ruger, but has done it in a way that is kind of counterproductive to the entire point. So one thing that I'm sure you've heard is that people talk about revolvers and say that you should carry with an empty chamber under the hammer. In a modern double action revolver, this is not really necessary. Some of the older single action designs that have a spur on the hammer, this kind of looks like a spur, but that's not a spur, it's not a firing pin. Some of the older designs, this may be true, but on the modern double action revolver, this is not true. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, the modern double action revolver uses a firing pin that is located here in the frame. It is held rearward away from the primer by a firing pin spring. So when you pull the trigger, the hammer falls and it hits the back of the firing pin, driving it forward. So there's no direct pressure on the firing pin when you're carrying it with the hammer down. Additionally, this pistol, this is a Taurus 856 chambered in 38 special, and this pistol uses a transfer bar safety. Now, transfer bar safety is very common on certain hammer-fired firearms. You might see them on hammer-fired shotguns and hammer-fired pistols. So what a transfer bar safety does is, I'll do a close-up with the other camera here in a minute, is when you pull the trigger, when the trigger is back, there's a bar that stays up and transfers the energy from the hammer to the firing pin. If, for instance, you were to drop this gun and the trigger was not held backwards, as the trigger goes forward, that safety drops down, and now the hammer cannot hit the firing pin. So the trigger has to be held to the rear by mechanical linkage to transfer the energy to the firing pin. Because of that, the revolver is kind of in the third category of the design safety that we talked about before. Because of the way it's designed, it is an inherently safe design, with the single action mode being an intentional action to cock the thing to prepare it for firing, and in double action mode, it is a long, heavy trigger pull. So it's very hard to fire one of these accidentally, especially if you're carrying in a good holster and you have your finger outside of the trigger guard where it's supposed to be. So it's not really necessary to carry on an empty chamber with a modern double action, even if it is a budget model like this Taurus. So you can put that to rest and feel confident that carrying with the hammer down, you can carry on a full chamber with a revolver. Now, I've seen some pretty interesting things on the internet lately, and one of them was that a couple of folks were pointing out that you can carry your Glock loaded if you clear the chamber, make sure it's empty, and you pull the trigger and insert the magazine loaded, then this gun is perfectly safe because it's already fired and there's nothing in the chamber. Well, this kind of goes on a little bit beyond belt and suspenders. This is more like wearing a condom while practicing abstinence. It doesn't really make any sense. The pulling the trigger doesn't do anything because the chamber was already empty. So as soon as you go to rack a round into it, of course you would have rounds in the magazine, and now you've cocked your gun and chambered around. There's a couple reasons. It doesn't really hurt anything to do that, except for the fact that you're not carrying with one in the chamber, which kind of defeats the purpose anyway. You can almost never guarantee that you're going to have time to rack around into the chamber, because in a self-defense situation, drawing your gun is one of the last case scenarios. You don't want to preemptively take it out and take a few minutes to get it ready to go. It's got to come out like an airbag and be ready when you are, or when you need it. So with that said, carrying with one in the chamber is the way to go from a tactical standpoint, but I'll explain to you why it is perfectly safe to do that in a Glock platform. So the first thing, just to show you that it's clear, I mean it's empty. The first safety feature on the Glock platform, this is a PSA Dagger, but it's almost identical to a Glock 19. So the first one is a trigger safety, and what the point of this is if a trigger has weight, that gives it mass, and if you were to drop it like this, that mass would try to pull the trigger to the rear, firing the gun. Well, the trigger safety has very little mass, and so it has very little inertia when dropped, and it has a fairly significant spring forcing it back to the front and keeps that trigger from moving to the rear if it's dropped. Additionally, it does require an affirmative trigger pull and not just kind of a casual scrape. So you have to actually intend to pull the trigger in order for this gun to go off. How it works is there's a nub here on the back of the trigger safety, and when you pull the trigger safety down, that retracts into the trigger, and then the trigger can clear the frame. If it's not done like that, then that block hits the frame and the trigger cannot be pulled. So this one uses a hinge trigger. Most of your actual Glocks are going to have something more like this, where they have a trigger blade in the middle. It does the same thing. There's a block here where the trigger cannot go to the rear until this is activated, and then it can clear the frame. You'll see the trigger block safety across a number of different platforms. It's very common on striker-fired guns. You're not going to see it very much on hammer-fired pistols, but on your striker-fired guns, it's going to be pretty common. So safety number 2 and 3 on the Glock platform, they market it as having 3 different safeties, but there's a little bit more to it than that. But safety number 2 is inside the gun, so we'll take it apart. I pull on the right lever. So the safety number 2 is the striker block safety. So in a striker fired gun, your striker is here in the slide. This plunger right here is what obstructs the striker's forward movement. So in order for the gun to fire, this plunger has to be pushed up into the slide. As we can see right now, there's no firing pin sticking out of the breech face. if we push this plunger in, and then we can move our striker forward, now the striker is protruding from the breech face. In order for this plunger to be actuated, it is acted upon by this lug here on the trigger bar. So when you pull the trigger, that lug moves rearward and up, and it pushes up on that plunger, and it clears the way for the striker to go by. Without this being moved to the rear, then the plunger is not moved and the striker cannot go forward. So even if you had, for some reason, if it went off when you dropped it, or if you had a mechanical failure in the fire control group, the pistol could still not go off because the plunger is not cleared from the striker. Now if we combine that with the trigger safety not allowing the trigger to move, then if the trigger can't move, then the plunger can't be moved, means the striker cannot hit the primer. So the striker block safety is not proprietary to Glock. There are a number of different firearms that you're going to see that on, but what you're looking for is if you field strip the firearm. Some gun shops will let you do that, some will do it for you, some won't let you do it at all, because sometimes you have to pull the trigger, like on a Glock design, and they won't take the trigger guard or the trigger lock off. I ran into that in the Cabela's. They wouldn't even let me functions test it. So I'm trying to buy a used gun, and I had to just kind of take it on faith that it was going to work. But anyway, if you look in here and you see this plunger, chances are that is a firing pin block or a striker block. Now this Ruger, it has a very similar mechanism. Just for the sake of illustration. Come on, get out of there. So on the bottom of the Ruger slide, you can see that plunger is right here, and it very closely resembles the one that's on our Glock system. Again, that is the striker block or the firing pin block safety, and it's found on a bunch of different platforms. Even on Series 80 1911s, if you look at the bottom of the slide, they'll have a plunger in there, and that'll be a firing pin block on the bottom of the 1911. So that prevents it from firing if the trigger's not pulled. So with that said, if for some reason that safety has been activated, you might hear a click, but that'll be the striker impacting that plunger instead of hitting the primer, in which case you would hear a bang. All right, now a lot of folks are concerned about dropping their pistols, and Glock has compensated for that. Because the way that this pistol fires, because when you pull the trigger, this bar right here, this is the trigger bar sear area, it drops vertically to disengage from the lug on our striker. So in order for it to do that, the trigger bar has to move rearward and then down. And you'll see on this side, there's a slot cut into this fire control group that prevents the trigger bar from moving downward to clear that striker. And in this particular design, the force of the striker itself forces this trigger bar forward and jams the trigger bar into that slot, so that the only way for the striker to move rearward is by a trigger pull, once again. So the entire Glock system is reliant on pulling the trigger. So what you're looking for when you're shopping for some of these is you can look at, if you're familiar with how the trigger mechanism works. Now, not all striker-fired handguns operate like this. This Dagger operates like this Ruger operates like this, but some other pistols use a traditional rotating sear type of design, and so they might not feature a drop safe that's designed like this. It might manifest itself a little bit differently. So the striker block safety and the drop safe on the Glock platform are both considered a passive safety. You don't really have to think about them. They're doing their job inside the gun, and if you throw the gun on the floor, you throw it against a wall, you drop it, as long as that gun is mechanically sound, it's not going to be a problem. And even if there is a mechanical failure, one of those safeties is going to pick up where the other one let down. Now, the classic example of an active safety is going to be our 1911. This is a Rock Island GI model, so this is a plain Jane, no frills 1911. And our active safety is that we have to manipulate this on the side of the gun. And how it works internally is the sear is engaged with the hammer. The sear is, imagine the little trip lever that allows the hammer to go forward. So a lot of people tend to think of hammer-fired pistols as kind of being like a mousetrap, where if you look at them wrong, they're going to go off. That's not really the case. Everything in here is made out of very robust metal parts that have a lot of mechanical force enacted upon them to either make them move or keep them from moving. So in the case of the 1911, the safety, when it's rotated in the up position, has a lever inside, and it forces against the sear, which is a chunk of metal, and it holds it and pins it against this hammer. So by flicking the safety off, it removes that block, and so when the trigger is pulled, the sear can rotate and it releases the hammer. Additionally, the 1911 has a grip safety. Now, grip safety, you could kind of count this as both a passive safety and as an active safety, because the user does have to grip the firearm in order for it to do its job, but at the same time, it's just the act of holding it that deactivates it. So it's kind of a passive and an active safety. Some shooters love a grip safety, some shooters hate them. I'm kind of indifferent on it. I think that a good one is good and a bad one is bad, because they're not all created equal. So I know that sounds kind of profound, but that's where we're at. This is a Series 70 1911. Now, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on different kinds of 1911s, but the Series 70 is kind of the original design as John Moses Browning intended. The Series 80 incorporates a couple of additional safety features. Primarily, it incorporates a firing pin safety block like the Glock, like the Ruger has, that prevents the firing pin from moving forward if the trigger is not pulled. The trigger is what clears that safety out of the way. Additionally, one of the design features of the 1911 is if for some reason the sear and hammer engagement fails, if you've got a bunch of worn out parts, or if you've got some damage, or maybe just a bad trigger job, if the hammer falls, I'll try and do it here, and the trigger's not being pulled, like here I release the trigger, then there's a safety hook on this, and some people call it the half-cock notch. It's kind of a safety hook, and the idea being that if the trigger were to slip, the safety notch catches that trigger. So if we were to release this and want to cock the pistol by hand, if we drop it, that safety notch catches that hammer and prevents it from falling. So even in the 1911, in the case of some kind of mechanical failure, that safety hook should be catching that hammer. Now, this relies on having springs that are in good condition, a safety hook that's in good condition, and a couple of other things. So, it can be a good idea to take your older gun or your used gun to a gunsmith, have them look it over, and make sure that everything is operating how it's supposed to be. Now, as far as the grip safety on the 1911, it functions almost exactly the same as the thumb safety. And there's a lever in here that rotates like this, and when you push on that, and it clears the sear. So as soon as that's cleared, then you can pull the trigger and the hammer can drop. So even with the safety off, as we have it here, if you're not activating that thumb safety, or that grip safety, the hammer cannot fall. But if we put a little pressure on here, we can kind of see where it's going to clear, and there we go. So both of those safeties are there. They both rely on the sear, but they're both fairly effective at what they're designed to do. Now, as far as being drop safe, some folks don't consider the 1911, especially the Series 70 1911, to be drop safe because it uses a free-floating firing pin, which means that if the firing pin is here, it can move forward up until a mechanical limit where it hits, but it's like significantly farther forward than your striker-fired guns. So what that means is if the firing pin is heavy and you dropped it right on the muzzle, there's a chance that the firing pin rides forward and hits that striker. Now, one of the ways that can be alleviated is by using a titanium firing pin. So it's lighter, it has less inertia, and thus it doesn't tend to travel as far forward as a heavier steel firing pin. Additionally, you could increase the strength of the firing pin spring. It's not too big of a deal, and that would help keep that safer as well. The Series 80 1911s, they don't have to worry about that because they have the firing pin block safety in the slide. But one of the complaints about those is that the 1911 is renowned for its wonderful trigger, and the Series 80, because of driving that safety, does degrade the trigger pull. So a gun that was 60 years old or 70 years old before that was even invented, so a lot of folks don't see it as necessary. So we discussed the system of Glock safeties, and that is one of the reasons why Glocks are not renowned for having a good trigger. Quite the opposite, in fact. Glocks have a reputation for having remarkably poor triggers. And that is because every time you pull the trigger, you're activating 1, 2, and 3 different safeties. And that's a bunch of mechanical parts in there that are rubbing together. If there's any imperfections on any of them, you can feel all of that in the trigger. Additionally, on the Glock platform, the gun is never really cocked per se before you pull the trigger. So this is one of those kind of third category design feature safeties that's not really listed as a safety, but what happens is when you pull the trigger, this trigger bar moves to the rear, and as it does that, it pushes our striker lug rearward, finishing the cocking action. As it sits in the gun, there's only just a little bit of spring tension on that, and it's doubtful that that would even have enough force to set off a cartridge without pulling the trigger. So by pulling the trigger, it finishes the cocking action, and you could call a Glock system a 1.5 action, I guess. It's not really a single action, it's not really a double action, it's kind of a weird middle ground. So those are most of what we would call a fire prevention safety. They prevent the gun from firing. There are a couple other safeties that manufacturers will implement in order to help people not shoot themselves. So one of those is the magazine disconnect. So the Ruger has a magazine disconnect, and the way it works is there's a secondary plunger in the slide, and it's very much like the striker block plunger, and it's actuated by the magazine. So when you put the magazine in, it lifts that plunger, it clears the way for the striker. So without that magazine in there, if we cock the gun, we can pull the trigger, we hear a click, and it sounds like it fired. But if we pull the slide to the rear, we can see that the firing pin is not protruding from the breech face. Now, if we reset the trigger mechanism, put the magazine in it, now we pull the trigger. If we look inside, now there's a firing pin protruding from the breech face. So what happens without the magazine is the firing mechanism goes through its series of different operations. The striker falls, but it hits that plunger because the plunger is not pushed out of the way by the magazine. Now there's a couple different ways that manufacturers do this. Another Ruger model that I have, if the magazine's not in the gun, you physically can't pull the trigger. So it's more of an interference safety. So along the same lines with the magazine disconnect, this is a Phoenix Arms HP 22 from the 70s, I do believe, in California. This gun has a couple of very interesting safety features on it that are kind of design flaws, I guess you could say. So if the gun has a thumb safety here, that also doubles as the slide lock. So if the pistol's on safe, is the only time you can remove the magazine, which is a little bit funny because if it's on safe, you can't open the slide to clear the chamber. So what you have to do is put the pistol on fire, and then you could lock the slide to the rear with the safety and then remove the magazine. If you do it in the wrong order, you'll get stuck with the magazine in the gun, or you'll get stuck with the slide closed, and it just is not an ideal system. Now the problem I have with magazine disconnects, it's not really applicable on this Ruger because they've designed their way around it, but if the standard means for clearing a pistol is you remove the magazine and then you inspect the chamber, and when you open this up, it ejects any cartridge that might be in there and allows you to inspect the chamber. Now, a lot of guns require you to pull the trigger to take the slide off. Oh, no worries, it's just a flash flood warning. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, with the magazine disconnect, in order to pull the trigger to take the slide off, you have to inspect your chamber and then put the magazine in. Now you can pull your trigger, but you've got a magazine, so you want to empty the magazine out. Then you can remove that, and then you can remove your slide. So when it comes to clearing a gun, I just don't like the idea of pulling the trigger with the magazine in the gun. It's just kind of a personal preference. It seems kind of counterintuitive to me that that's how you'd have to take it apart. Now the reason on a Glock pistol that you have to pull the trigger is because there's no way for the trigger bar to clear the sear. So you have to pull the trigger, it drops the sear, and now the striker can clear the trigger bar and come off the gun. On the Ruger, they've designed their way around it. So on this particular gun, what you do is you lock this back and then you push down on the ejector. We'll take the slide off here, and I'll show you why that is. So the ejector on this gun rotates up and down, which is kind of an odd feature. But what it does is when you open the slide, you lock it to the rear, you have to stick your finger in there, make sure that there's no magazine, make sure there's nothing in the chamber, and then when you push this down, it drops the trigger bar so that the slide can clear it without pulling the trigger. So it's kind of a clever workaround there. SIG has done something similar on some of their models where the takedown lever rotates and it drops that trigger bar down. Kind of fulfills the same purpose. So this Ruger has about as many safety features as any gun I've ever seen, where it has a trigger safety, it has a striker block safety, it has a drop safety similar to the Glock, it has a thumb safety, it has a magazine disconnect, which also serves as a secondary striker block safety. On top of that, it is a double action pistol. So if we put our slide back on here, so if you look at the back of this pistol, you'll see the back of the striker. So as we pull the trigger, you'll see the striker slowly move towards the rear of the pistol, and then it falls forward. So that means that the action of the trigger is pushing the striker back, and then it's releasing and dropping and letting the striker go forward. That's very much the way that the Glock works, but you can't see it in the Glock. So the last thing we're going to go over is the double action semi-automatic pistol. So this is a SAR B6. It's very similar to your CZ75. There's lots of different variations of this. And we'll notice that if we look at the outside of this gun, it does have a thumb safety. This thumb safety is a little bit unique in that you can activate the safety without it being cocked, but that prevents it from firing in double action mode. And it also lacks a trigger safety, but because of its design, it doesn't really require one. Now, the reason for that is that it is a double action pistol. So it is hammer fired, much like the revolver. We can cock it and fire it that way, or we can just pull the trigger to the rear and fire it like that. So it's similar in operation to a double action revolver, but then the cycle and reloading process is the same as any other semi-automatic. Now internally, this gun also has a firing pin block, and the way that it works is when the hammer is cocked, a lever is raised inside the gun and it clears the path for the firing pin to go forward, and it's held there by the trigger holding it up. Now if for some reason you were to drop the hammer when you're cocking it manually, it also has a safety hook, and if the hammer were to fall without pulling the trigger, the safety hook would catch it, and additionally it has that firing pin block in it. So this is a very safe design. I can't really speak to the quality of this particular pistol. It's very inexpensive. But the variants of this were like the CZ75 or something kind of like the little Browning High Power, but the Browning High Power is a single action. They're pretty safe designs. A lot of folks do like this. They think it is kind of the ultimate combination of double action revolver safety along with the modern safety features of a semi-automatic. So at the end of all this, I hope we've covered most of the different safety features. There's, of course, different safety features on the market out there that I haven't covered here because there's tens of thousands of different kinds of designs. But these are the most popular designs that you're going to see on the most popular styles of handguns. One thing that I didn't have a chance to cover because I don't have one here is a decocking lever. And so it would be something similar on this design. And some of these have them where if the pistol is cocked, you could move this thumb lever down and it would decock the pistol without firing it. So that way you didn't have to carry it locked and you didn't have to risk lowering the hammer with your thumb and inadvertently potentially setting it off. So I think we've covered most of the different designs of safeties here, and I hope that this goes to show that carrying one in the pipe is safe for a variety of reasons, and that there are redundant systems that are keeping that cartridge from detonating in the barrel for any reason other than pulling the trigger. So if you carry in a good holster and you keep your booger hook off the bang switch, there's no reason for a quality firearm to go off anywhere except where you point it. So I thank you for watching me this long. If you like this kind of stuff, please hit a like, and YouTube has made it pretty obvious that they're not super fond of firearms content, and the best thing you can do is leave a comment down below. Let me know what I missed. Let me know if there's something else that you'd like me to add, and let me know if there's some other technical question that you'd like to have a video on. So I'm hoping to do a lot more on a much more regular basis here in the near future. It's been a very interesting fall, to say the least, now that we're into winter. So thanks for sticking around this long, and we'll hope to see you in the next one. Thanks a bunch.